Hello, this is Colin Liddell, and this is the Shortpod, a brief and succinct podcast on the events and issues of the day. And today it is the 19th of September 2021. It has now been about a month since the Taliban took over in Afghanistan, and today I want to talk about history repeating itself, because I think in the case of Afghanistan, history has clearly repeated itself. But I don't mean that in the conventional way of some superpower getting beat up by the lowly Afghani mountain people. I don't buy into the Chad Taliban meme. I don't think the Afghanis are some kind of super warriors who can defeat empires. I think the British Empire basically ran them ragged for around a century and did what they wanted with the country. So, no, the US defeat in Afghanistan is not the latest in a long line of humbled empires, although it's clear that America has, in this case, been somewhat humbled. Now, what I mean by history repeating itself is that when the American-led coalition defeated the Taliban initially in 2001 and took over the country, they basically repeated exactly the same mistakes that they had made 136 years ago. Yes, I'm talking about the American conquest of the Confederate States in the so-called American Civil War. Now, usually a civil war is between people who are of the same race, ethnicity, and culture. But in the case of the so-called American Civil War, while race was more or less the same and even language was more or less the same, there were definite ethnic and cultural differences between the so-called northern states and the so-called southern states. What we have is a kind of civilizational clash between a southern agrarian society defined by Anglo and Scottish descended Americans and a more urbanized northern society defined by New England Puritans and more recent immigrants. Now, when the Americans took over Afghanistan, what they did, they pushed out the Pashtun, because the Pashtun were the Taliban, and they brought in the Uzbeks and the Tajiks and the Hazaras. This is identical to what the North did to the South. When the North conquered the South in 1865, they pushed out the Confederate whites. They brought in the carpetbaggers. Not only did they liberate and enfranchise the blacks, but they also disenfranchised the whites, which led to the former Confederate states being taken over by new regimes who based their power on an alliance between carpetbaggers and former slaves. Naturally, the former rulers of these states, who still held a lot of power and influence, were not too pleased about it. This is exactly the same pattern that we see in Afghanistan, where the triumphant American military put in a regime that was based upon Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Hazaras. Although some effort was made to include Pashtuns, probably on the advice of the British, this didn't go very far. So you had the former dominant group pushed out by American military power, and you had formerly subject groups pushed into positions of power. This proved to be a very unstable solution to the problem. In the case of the Southern Confederate States, the Reconstruction period lasted around 10 years or so, and then the carpetbagger and former slave regimes were pushed out by the resurgent, dominant white population. This is exactly what has just happened in Afghanistan. And there are other similarities as well, because the Taliban are not entirely unlike the KKK. The KKK re-established the power of the formerly dominant white majority in those southern states by conducting a clandestine campaign of fear and terror. And the Taliban did something quite similar, kind of lurking in the shadows, exerting influence, using fear, the threat of violence, much more than the actuality of violence in many cases, and reminding the formerly dominant Pashtun group that they were the means by which they could regain power. So Afghanistan 2021 is very, very similar to the Southern Confederate States in the 1970s.